The evening rush was well underway at the Southern Breeze, a cozy restaurant nestled in a quiet Texas suburb. Amber, a 25-year-old waitress, moved gracefully between tables, balancing plates and a warm smile. Despite her exhaustion, she maintained her composure, accustomed to masking her weariness behind unwavering professionalism. At one corner table, an elderly couple gave her an appreciative nod as she placed their orders before them. Amber smiled gently and stepped aside, eyes scanning the dining room. The air hummed with chatter and clinking dishes, but tonight tension rippled beneath the surface. A sudden voice broke her thoughts. "Amber, a word?" It was Jason, the newly appointed restaurant manager. At 29, his youthful authority often manifested itself abruptly. She approached cautiously, sensing trouble from his stern gaze. "We need to talk about your service tonight," Jason began coldly, his voice loud enough for surrounding tables to overhear. "Your tables have been waiting too long." Amber's heart sank. She quickly glanced around, noting the curious eyes turning their way. Embarrassment burned her cheeks. She had meticulously served her customers without delays, at least those within her responsibility. "Jason, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she began softly, mindful of her audience. "The delay was due to the kitchen mixing up orders, not my—" Jason raised his palm sharply, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Excuses aren't helpful, Amber. Just improve your performance," he stated bluntly, turning his back before she could respond. Her stomach twisted. Nearby, Caroline, the restaurant's owner, sat at the bar, observing the interaction silently. Amber searched Caroline's face for support, but the older woman looked away, pretending not to notice the awkwardness unfolding before her. Defeated, Amber returned to her tables, forcing a calm expression onto her face. A sympathetic glance came from Luis, a 34-year-old Latino chef standing briefly by the kitchen door. He offered a discreet nod of solidarity before vanishing into the heat of the kitchen. Throughout the rest of her shift, Amber replayed the scene in her mind, frustration gnawing at her thoughts. She wondered if Jason would have spoken similarly to Megan, her white co-worker, who had repeatedly made mistakes without receiving public reprimands. Hours later, as the last guest departed, Amber quietly wiped tables, listening to the clink of dishes being washed in the back. She knew well the invisible border she had crossed the moment she'd stepped through the doors of the Southern Breeze. No matter her diligence, effort, or politeness, her skin color created an unspoken boundary that dictated how far her professionalism could protect her. Before leaving for the night, she glanced back at the empty dining area, quiet and shadow-filled. Here, within these walls, Amber felt painfully seen and yet cruelly invisible, bound by limitations that others refused to acknowledge. Stepping into the darkened street, Amber drew a deep breath, preparing herself again for tomorrow, aware that the invisible border she carried would follow her endlessly into another day. Inside the steamy, bustling kitchen of the Southern Breeze, Luis expertly flipped steaks and managed pots simmering with sauces, moving swiftly between stations with practiced ease. At 34, he'd mastered culinary skills many chefs spent lifetimes perfecting. Yet, each shift seemed to bring new challenges, none of which were related to cooking. "Luis, hurry it up! We've got customers waiting!" barked Brandon, another chef. Brandon was younger, louder, and notably confident. Luis noticed how easily Brandon's mistakes were dismissed by Jason and Caroline, his apologies accepted without hesitation. Luis, meanwhile, felt perpetually on thin ice. "Already working as fast as I can," Luis replied calmly, keeping frustration out of his voice. He knew better than to show irritation. One slip of emotion could earn him the label of difficult, a tag he saw disproportionately pinned onto cooks like himself. As he plated another perfectly cooked dish, Luis overheard Brandon quietly mutter something to another cook, Travis. "Guess they hired him to meet a quota, huh?" Luis felt his jaw tighten but remained silent. Words like these were frequent whispers behind his back, comments masked as jokes, delivered just within earshot but too quiet for confrontation. When the dinner rush finally ebbed, Luis stepped outside for fresh air. The alley behind the restaurant offered little peace. The humid night air clung to him, mixing with his exhaustion. The door behind him opened softly, and Amber stepped out, her face shadowed with fatigue. "Rough shift?" Luis asked quietly, nodding at her with empathy. Amber exhaled deeply. "You have no idea." "I think I do," Luis said, smiling faintly. "Jason giving you trouble again?" Amber nodded. "I can't make a single mistake. Even when I'm flawless, he still finds something. But Megan drops plates, mixes orders. No one notices." Luis sighed, leaning against the brick wall. "I know. Tonight Brandon said something about me only being here for quotas. Can you believe it? Amber looked at him with understanding, recognizing immediately the same bitter sting of quiet prejudice she'd tasted earlier. And they say racism doesn't exist anymore, she whispered with ironic bitterness. Luis looked away, studying the dimly lit street beyond. He thought of his parents, who had worked tirelessly to provide him a life better than theirs. How they'd urged him always to hold his head high, to prove his worth through skill and hard work. Yet, in moments like these, Luis wondered if effort alone could break the chains others silently placed around him. My father used to say respect would come with talent and hard work, Luis murmured quietly. But how long does it take? Sometimes it feels like no matter how good we get, we stay invisible. Amber nodded slowly. Invisible or too visible in all the wrong ways. They stood silently for a moment, connected by shared experiences of marginalization hidden beneath polite smiles and quiet endurance. Suddenly, the kitchen door burst open again, revealing Jason, clipboard in hand. Luis, prep tomorrow's stock before you leave. Amber, finish cleaning tables. He snapped quickly before disappearing back inside. Luis shook his head slowly, pushing himself off the wall. I guess we'd better head back. Amber followed quietly, their brief respite shattered by Jason's dismissive tone. Inside, Luis found himself back at his station, chopping vegetables mechanically. The blade rhythmically tapped the cutting board, matching his heartbeat, as thoughts surged through him like an internal storm. He remembered when he'd first applied to the southern breeze, full of optimism and pride. Now, he felt himself shrinking under the invisible yet crushing weight of subtle prejudice. Later that night, after the kitchen lights dimmed and silence returned, Luis finished his last tasks. He moved slowly toward the exit, pausing briefly at the restaurant's dining area, dark and deserted. His gaze settled on the tables, where just hours ago Amber had faced humiliation. Luis realized their struggles were woven into the same fabric, unseen yet felt profoundly. He exited into the humid night once more, this time alone. Walking home along quiet streets lit only by dim street lamps, Luis wondered how long he could sustain the endless dance of proving himself worthy in a space that consistently refused to recognize his value. Arriving at his modest apartment, Luis unlocked the door quietly. Silence enveloped him, echoing the solitude he often felt. He sat down heavily, removing his chef's coat with a weary sigh. The silence pressed harder, making room for thoughts he'd suppressed all day. Was it worth it? Could he truly break through the shadowy barriers around him? Tonight, no answers came. Luis simply lay back, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling, feeling invisible lines etched across his soul, boundaries drawn silently by those who never needed words to diminish him. Tomorrow, he knew, he'd rise again and return to the southern breeze, hoping someday the shadows would lift, letting the world finally see him clearly. Across town, 22-year-old Sam sat quietly in the spacious but austere office of Jennifer Carter, a respected professor at Ashton University. The university campus was a picturesque stretch of manicured lawns, historic buildings, and ivy-covered walls, a place supposedly free from prejudice and biases. Yet Sam often felt more like an outsider here than he ever had anywhere else. Jennifer Carter, 47, well known for her rigorous standards and sharp intellect, was leafing through Sam's latest research paper, eyebrows knitted together critically. Sam sat stiffly, his hands resting nervously on his knees. Samuel, Jennifer began slowly, intentionally pronouncing his full name. I'm a bit puzzled by the depth of your analysis here. Sam felt tension tighten in his chest. He had worked painstakingly on this paper, putting in extra hours at the library and seeking feedback from fellow students. In what way, Professor Carter? He asked cautiously. Jennifer's eyes narrowed, holding up the paper slightly as if inspecting evidence. It's exceptionally detailed, perhaps even too polished. Did you write this entirely by yourself? The question stung. Sam hesitated briefly, stunned by the subtle yet cutting accusation hidden within her words. He'd heard this skepticism before, always disguised as curiosity or praise, but never failing to question his credibility. I assure you, Professor, this work is entirely mine, Sam replied carefully, forcing calm into his voice. I spent weeks on research and revisions. Jennifer leaned back slightly, sighing as if unconvinced. Of course, Samuel. I'm merely surprised. It's unusual for someone at your level to demonstrate such sophistication. Sam's stomach twisted painfully. At my level? He echoed softly. Jennifer quickly recovered, realizing she'd made her implication too clear. I only mean you're still an undergraduate. Such precision is rare. But Sam knew better. His friends, mostly white students, received straightforward praise for similar achievements. Their excellence was rarely questioned, and their success was expected, not scrutinized. Yet for him, every accomplishment was suspicious, somehow unexpected. "Thank you, Professor," Sam responded quietly, suppressing his hurt. "I'll take that as a compliment." Jennifer nodded dismissively, already glancing back at her desk, signaling their conversation was over. "Of course, Samuel. Continue your good work." Sam rose and exited her office slowly, feeling exhausted by yet another encounter masked in subtle discrimination. As he walked down the hallway, passing groups of chatting students, he felt painfully conspicuous, yet simultaneously invisible, caught between worlds that never fully embraced him. Outside, the sky darkened as evening settled across the campus. Sam's thoughts were heavy, each step dragging him further into reflection. No matter his effort, no matter his meticulous preparation, he always stood at the crossroads of double standards. It was a path he'd grown tired of traveling but saw no way around. As Sam approached the campus gates, a familiar yellow taxi pulled up beside him. He glanced inside, immediately recognizing Marcus, the 28-year-old driver who frequently shuttled students around Ashton. "Hey, Sam, need a lift?" Marcus asked warmly, his deep voice and bright smile providing welcome relief from the day's heaviness. Sam smiled gratefully. "Yeah, that'd be great." He climbed into the back seat, closing the door gently. Marcus glanced at him through the rearview mirror, noting Sam's strained expression. "Tough day?" Sam nodded slowly. "The usual." Marcus didn't press immediately, instead pulling smoothly away from the curb. Streets slid by quietly as darkness enveloped the city, neon signs and streetlights washing the interior of the car in rhythmic pulses of color and shadow. "You know," Sam eventually spoke, leaning forward slightly, "Professor Carter questioned if my paper was actually mine, again." Marcus sighed deeply, shaking his head. "Man, I'm sorry to hear that. They always gotta doubt us, huh?" Sam's voice dropped, frustration clear. "They never outright accuse you of anything. It's just subtle, like, how could someone like me possibly achieve something without help?" Marcus nodded thoughtfully, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Yeah, it's everywhere. Like passengers who get surprised I speak clearly or know directions better than their GPS. Like I can't be both black and professional." The two men fell into silence, the shared pain of their experiences resonating deeply. Each encounter, however brief or subtle, added invisible burdens they carried daily, each moment reshaping their lives quietly but persistently. Marcus finally broke the silence, offering comfort tempered by realism. "You know, Sam, sometimes I think they don't even realize they're doing it. It's so ingrained, it's normal to them." Sam nodded slowly. "And that's the worst part. How can you fight something people refuse to acknowledge exists?" Marcus smiled gently, glancing briefly at Sam through the mirror. "By never letting their doubts become your reality, man. That's how." The car slowed as they reached Sam's small apartment complex. Sam hesitated before exiting, feeling some relief from their conversation yet knowing the struggle remained. "Thanks, Marcus," he said sincerely, stepping out into the cool night air. "Anytime," Marcus replied warmly, watching Sam walk toward the building before driving away. Inside his apartment, Sam sat quietly on the sofa, surrounded by textbooks and papers. The room felt strangely heavy tonight, filled with the echoes of the day's frustrations. Tomorrow he knew he'd return to campus, confront Jennifer's skepticism again, and carry forward the invisible weight of double standards. Yet tonight, in the quiet solitude, Sam vowed silently that he would never let their doubts become his truth. He would persist, even when the world questioned his right to succeed. The city streets glowed softly under a dim veil of streetlights as Marcus guided his taxi carefully through late-night traffic. At 28, he had spent several years navigating these familiar routes, each ride offering a glimpse into lives far different from his own. From behind the wheel, Marcus observed the city intimately, a quiet witness to humanity's daily interactions, some genuine, others painfully shallow. Tonight felt heavier than usual, the conversation with Sam still fresh in his mind. Marcus knew well the quiet judgments masked as casual conversations. Passengers often seemed startled by his eloquence or suspicious of his politeness, as if his mere presence behind the wheel required justification. It was subtle yet relentless, a perpetual reminder of invisible boundaries he couldn't cross. As he slowed at a red light, Marcus's taxi was flagged down by a woman standing outside an upscale restaurant, the Southern Breeze. She stepped into the back seat, smoothing her coat gracefully as she settled in. "Good evening," Marcus greeted warmly, glancing briefly into the rearview mirror. "Evening," she replied curtly. Marcus recognized her immediately. Caroline Fletcher, 53 years old, owner of the restaurant. Her refined appearance and composed expression seemed typical of her usual demeanor. "Where to tonight?" Marcus asked calmly, already anticipating her request. "Sycamore Heights," she replied, her tone steady, poised, authoritative. Marcus nodded and eased the taxi away from the curb, merging smoothly with traffic. For a few minutes, silence dominated the interior, Caroline's eyes gazing absently at passing storefronts and illuminated billboards. Finally, as if filling an uncomfortable void, she spoke again. "You know, sometimes I envy your job," she remarked casually. "You must hear a lot of fascinating stories." Marcus smiled politely, noting the irony. "You could say that," he agreed. "People do reveal quite a bit when they're in the back seat." Caroline leaned back thoughtfully. "I suppose you see society from a unique angle, observing everyone, rich, poor, black, white. I often think we've reached a point where these differences hardly matter anymore. Don't you agree?" Marcus hesitated briefly, choosing his words with care. "Well, in theory, yes. But from this seat, I see differences still matter very much to some." Caroline shifted slightly, genuinely surprised. "Really? I find that hard to believe. Look around. Opportunities seem more equal than ever. People just need ambition, drive." Marcus glanced briefly into the mirror, noting her assured confidence. "Ambition is important," he acknowledged quietly. "But sometimes, certain doors are easier to open for some people than for others." Caroline appeared thoughtful, processing his words slowly. "Interesting," she said, though her voice indicated mild skepticism. "I've never felt that." Marcus smiled wryly, noting the irony again. "Maybe that's because you've never needed to." She grew silent, considering his words with mild discomfort. Marcus, sensing he'd touched a nerve, returned his attention fully to the road. He understood Caroline's worldview was shaped by privilege, not malice. She had never had to navigate the invisible barriers he faced every day. Her perspective was sincere, yet inherently limited by her own experiences. After several minutes, Caroline spoke again, softer now. "You really believe it's that different?" Marcus's voice was gentle yet firm. "I don't just believe it, Ms. Fletcher. I live it, every day." She didn't respond immediately, and silence once again settled over the car. Marcus could sense her unease, perhaps even her realization dawning slowly in the quiet. Soon, the taxi turned onto the broad, tree-lined avenue of Sycamore Heights, a wealthy neighborhood where gated homes and manicured lawns seemed worlds apart from Marcus's modest apartment. He slowed carefully before Caroline's elegant home, pulling smoothly to a stop. "Here we are," he announced quietly. Caroline paid him quickly, pausing as she opened the door. "Thank you," she said softly, glancing at Marcus with a brief, uncertain smile. "You're welcome," Marcus replied kindly. He watched as she walked slowly toward her front door, keys jangling softly. Marcus wondered if their brief conversation had genuinely impacted her, or if tomorrow she would retreat back behind the comfortable illusion that everyone stood on equal footing. Driving away into the darkness, Marcus felt weariness in his bones, a familiar tiredness, deeper than physical exhaustion. He knew people like Caroline sincerely believed discrimination belonged in the past, comfortably distant from their current lives. Yet for Marcus, every polite dismissal, every moment of doubt, every subtle questioning of his worth was a stark reminder that progress was incomplete. Eventually, Marcus turned onto his quiet street. He parked the taxi, turning off the engine and letting silence surround him again. Sitting alone, Marcus thought of Sam, Amber, and Luis, each fighting their invisible battles, each striving daily against boundaries others refused to acknowledge. With a heavy sigh, Marcus stepped out of the car into the cooling night air. His building loomed quietly before him, windows glowing softly, hinting at lives within, each holding their own invisible struggles. Marcus wondered briefly if the city, so beautiful from afar, would ever truly see him, or if he'd forever remain simply another shadow beyond its countless windows. Tonight, though burdened by doubts and weary from subtle battles fought daily, Marcus chose to believe that recognition could someday replace invisibility. After all, hope was still powerful, even in shadows. Late morning sunlight filtered softly through the elegant windows of the southern breeze, warming the polished wooden floors and neatly arranged tables. The restaurant was quiet, calm before the inevitable afternoon rush. Caroline Fletcher, poised as always, sat at a secluded corner table reviewing financial reports. Across from her, Jason Evans, the young manager she'd recently appointed, tapped his pen impatiently against a notepad. "I'd like to discuss staff promotions today," Caroline began smoothly, eyes carefully scanning her notes. "We have several employees who've shown outstanding dedication." Jason leaned forward slightly, interested yet visibly cautious. "Who did you have in mind?" Caroline glanced up, meeting Jason's guarded expression. "Amber, for one. She's extremely efficient, polite, and customers often compliment her." Jason's expression tightened noticeably, his hesitation clear. "Amber? She's certainly friendly, but I'm not sure she fits the image we're trying to maintain here." Caroline paused, considering his words carefully. "What exactly do you mean by image, Jason?" Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly struggling to articulate his objection without sounding prejudiced. "You know, her presentation, her mannerisms, they're not exactly aligned with our target clientele." Caroline's brow furrowed slightly, sensing the troubling undertone. Yet instead of challenging Jason directly, she hesitated, unsure if she wanted the tension of confronting him now. Privately, she recalled Marcus's words from their conversation the previous night, words she'd initially dismissed but now echoed faintly, unsettlingly. "You really think Amber's presentation is an issue?" she asked softly, attempting neutrality. Jason sighed, relaxing slightly, misinterpreting her tone as agreement. "Exactly. We have standards. Megan, for example, perfectly fits our restaurant's atmosphere. Professional, elegant. Amber is competent, yes, but we need to think carefully about appearances." Caroline glanced away, troubled by Jason's implicit bias, yet unwilling to admit she understood precisely what he implied. A brief flash of guilt surged within her. Caroline had always thought herself fair, just, and open-minded. Yet here, faced directly with discrimination cloaked neatly in managerial language, she hesitated, reluctant to rock the boat. Behind the restaurant's ornate divider, Luis moved quietly through the dining area, pausing when he overheard Jason mention Amber's name. Hidden from their view, Luis stood frozen, listening carefully as their conversation continued. "Are you suggesting we prioritize Megan for promotion because Amber doesn't fit some unspoken standard?" Caroline finally pressed lightly, though clearly hesitant. Jason leaned back defensively. "Look, Caroline, I'm just being realistic. Our patrons have expectations. Amber's good, but we must consider who best represents us publicly. That's Megan." Luis's stomach tightened sharply as he heard Jason's words, clear yet carefully veiled. Anger surged quietly through him, tempered by bitter recognition. The invisible boundary he'd known for years was now explicitly revealed, hidden in plain sight behind gentle phrases and evasive language. Caroline paused a moment longer, wavering between confrontation and passive acceptance. Ultimately, the fear of unsettling the comfortable balance she'd maintained at the Southern Breeze prevailed. "Very well," she finally said quietly. "We'll revisit promotions again soon. Let's not rush this decision." Jason nodded, clearly satisfied with the compromise, unaware of the conflict he'd reignited within Caroline's conscience. Quietly retreating, Luis stepped back into the kitchen, his thoughts racing furiously. Anger battled disappointment as he reflected on Caroline's decision, her silence as damaging as Jason's prejudiced words. Later that evening, as Amber carefully prepared tables for incoming guests, Luis approached cautiously, unsure if he should share what he'd overheard. "Amber," Luis began softly, hesitation evident in his voice. "I overheard something today between Jason and Caroline." Amber paused, turning toward him curiously. "What was it?" Luis hesitated again before gently continuing. "They talked about promotions. Caroline suggested you, but Jason argued you didn't fit their image. Caroline didn't object." Amber's expression fell slightly, her eyes reflecting familiar hurt. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised." Luis shook his head slowly, frustrated. "It's not right. And the worst part is, Caroline let it go. She knows better." Amber's voice softened, weary but not defeated. "Sometimes people choose comfort over justice, Luis. It's easier to pretend a problem doesn't exist than to fix it." Luis nodded bitterly, reflecting deeply on Amber's words. He saw clearly now how Caroline's silence, the quiet avoidance of confrontation, allowed discrimination to persist, invisible yet devastatingly present. As the evening progressed, Amber moved quietly between tables, her smile resilient yet burdened with hidden grief. Luis cooked mechanically, each dish prepared with skill but lacking his usual passion. Both carried their knowledge silently, the invisible lines drawn around them clearer than ever. After the restaurant emptied, Caroline stood alone by the front windows, gazing thoughtfully into the darkness beyond. She replayed her conversation with Jason, guilt nudging gently at her conscience. Marcus's words from their earlier ride echoed insistently now, demanding recognition she struggled to give. Privilege had shielded her from realities others faced daily. Yet, even aware, Caroline felt powerless, unsure how to address prejudice so ingrained, so quietly destructive. Instead, she chose silence, retreating behind comfortable boundaries. When the restaurant doors finally locked behind her, Caroline stepped out into the night, unsettled and uncertain. For the first time, she truly sensed the weight of what she'd allowed to continue within her own establishment. Walking away, Caroline realized how easily prejudice thrived, not through open hatred, but through quiet tolerance, silence, and invisible complicity. She promised herself she would do better, but tonight, guilt overshadowed hope. A soft rain drizzled gently onto the quiet streets, creating shimmering reflections beneath the amber glow of streetlights. Inside the small, cozy cafe known simply as Haven, Amber sat at a corner table, staring thoughtfully out the foggy window. Her shift had ended nearly an hour ago, but the weight of the day lingered, heavy and unyielding. Across from her, Luis nursed a cup of black coffee, his eyes distant and reflective. Neither had spoken for several minutes, each absorbed in their own thoughts, their silence comfortable yet burdened by shared frustrations. The warmth of the cafe contrasted sharply with the cold, persistent reality awaiting them beyond its welcoming doors. The cafe door chimed softly as Marcus stepped in, shaking droplets from his coat. Spotting Amber and Luis, he approached quickly, a tired smile softening his exhausted expression. "Mind if I join you two?" Marcus asked gently. "Please," Amber responded warmly, pulling out an empty chair. Luis nodded his greeting, relieved to see Marcus's familiar presence. Marcus settled quietly, noting their heavy expressions. "Tough day?" Amber smiled sadly, tracing the rim of her cup with her finger. "The usual. Jason blocked my promotion again." Marcus sighed, understanding immediately. "And Caroline?" Luis answered softly, bitterness in his tone. She said nothing. Silence, as always. Marcus shook his head, recognizing the painful familiarity of their stories. The invisible boundaries they all navigated daily, the exhausting task of confronting subtle prejudice, united them silently. The door chimed once more, admitting another familiar face, Sam, looking weary yet unsurprised to find this gathering of friends. Spotting them immediately, he approached with quiet relief, his backpack sliding to the floor as he sat. "You too?" Marcus asked gently. Sam nodded, exhaustion clear in his voice. "Professor Carter again. More doubt, more subtle accusations." Amber leaned forward slightly, eyes thoughtful. "Do you think they even realize the damage they cause?" Marcus answered quietly, eyes solemn. "Maybe not. But ignorance isn't an excuse, not anymore." The group fell quiet, absorbing the weight of Marcus's words. As silence lingered briefly, a sudden movement caught their attention. Professor Jennifer Carter stood hesitantly near their table, having overheard Marcus's statement. The professor looked unusually uncertain, her normally assured expression troubled. "Professor Carter?" Sam asked, surprised and cautious. I'm sorry for interrupting," Jennifer began gently, voice filled with hesitation. "I overheard your conversation and, well, I couldn't help but listen." Sam watched her closely, uncertain how to respond. Jennifer drew a deep breath, visibly struggling to speak her next words clearly. "I never intended harm, Samuel, but listening to you all, I realized something tonight. I'm part of the problem. My doubts, my scrutiny, I thought they were harmless, even helpful, but now—" She trailed off, embarrassment visible in her posture. Amber studied Jennifer curiously. Here was someone finally recognizing the invisible boundaries they faced daily. Luis and Marcus exchanged quiet, meaningful glances, sensing an important moment unfolding. "Understanding the problem is a start," Marcus finally said quietly, his voice gentle yet firm. Jennifer nodded slowly, regret in her eyes. "And I have much more to learn." Sam offered a tentative smile, accepting her acknowledgement cautiously. "That's more than many people admit." Jennifer smiled gratefully, clearly uncomfortable yet determined. I'm truly sorry, Sam. Sam nodded softly. Thank you, Professor. After a polite pause, Jennifer quietly excused herself, leaving the group in contemplative silence. The gravity of her acknowledgement lingered powerfully, filling the space between them with cautious hope. Amber finally broke the silence, speaking softly yet decisively. At least someone sees now. Maybe others can too. Marcus nodded slowly, contemplating her words. But awareness is just the first step. True change takes courage. Action. Luis's voice was steady, reflective. Yet without that awareness, nothing can begin. Their conversation flowed freely now, voices blending together quietly yet powerfully, expressing hopes tempered by realism. Each shared openly, relieved by this rare moment of genuine connection, a brief respite from the heavy solitude each normally carried. Eventually, the cafe's lights dimmed gently, signaling closing time. Outside, the drizzle had ceased, leaving behind glistening streets bathed in calm night air. Rising slowly, each new tomorrow awaited with familiar challenges, yet tonight something had shifted slightly. Hope now carried more weight than fatigue. Stepping outside together, they stood briefly beneath a street lamp, reluctant to part. Marcus spoke softly, capturing their collective feelings. Tonight feels important, doesn't it? Amber smiled warmly, nodding. It does. Sam glanced thoughtfully down the street, his expression thoughtful yet determined. Maybe someday conversations like these won't be rare. Louise smiled quietly. We'll keep having them until they're not needed anymore. They shared quiet laughter, knowing their journey toward equality was uncertain, filled with struggles ahead. Yet tonight, standing together, they felt stronger, united by their shared experiences and hopes. As each moved quietly toward home, Amber paused briefly, glancing back at her friends, silhouettes fading softly into the night. She understood clearly now the invisible boundaries they faced daily required constant resilience. But more importantly, she knew that none of them walked alone. Tonight, the city felt a little less isolating, a little more hopeful, illuminated softly by friendship and recognition of shared struggles. Tomorrow remained uncertain, boundaries still present. But Amber carried forward an inner strength, deeper now, knowing others walked beside her. Their paths crossed, separated, yet intertwined permanently by the invisible yet powerful thread of mutual understanding. Boundaries becoming clearer, acknowledged, yet slowly losing power as they moved together into the quiet night.